Good evening, everybody. I think we're ready to start. My name is Tabitha, and this is my classmate, Hillary. On behalf of our sociology class, we are pleased to see this turnout, and we are looking forward to learning more about the climate crisis. We would also like to thank our professor, Dr. Hayes, for being a guiding hand in this process. Before starting, we would like to acknowledge that our event is being given from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqey. The Peace and Friendship Treaty signed in the 1700s represent a sign of peace and respect between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy people. We are thankful to live along the Wolastoq River, which serves as a reminder of our climate's beauty. We are welcomed by two guests who will be teaching us about the climate crisis, and we will finish with an open discussion for questions that Hillary will mediate. So please don't hesitate to think of anything as the presentations are happening. So first, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Jason MacLean, who is a professor at the Fredericton University of New Brunswick and teaches environmental law and policy. Jason MacLean is an assistant professor and in the Faculty of Law. MacLean specializes in environmental law and policy. MacLean's PhD dissertation, which he completed at the University of Alberta, was titled Essays on the Law and Politics of Canada's Climate Policy. MacLean's current research interests are environmental law, climate change, and energy policy and natural resources law. So you can take it away, Jason.
Oh, thanks very much. I'm honored and delighted to be invited, and I really just want to begin by applauding you folks for organizing this and for everybody who's decided to give up, what's today, Wednesday? Your Wednesday evening to learn a little bit more about the challenge of climate change, and in particular what's going on at the present moment. So I'm really happy to be here, and I just want to congratulate you for taking this initiative. I can say as a professor and also as somebody who's deeply concerned about the climate, that your interest in your initiative is very encouraging and heartwarming. Now, with all those sort of fun, happy, warm, mushy things, now I'm going to proceed into the grim part of my presentation, but I'm not going to try and dwell on it for very long. I've been asked to talk a little bit about what's going on at COP26 presently in Glasgow, and what COP26 is, what's at stake, and what the various options are. And I should just say in advance that I'll probably end up talking about quite a few different numbers, and I'm going to try and put them into context so that you can understand them. I'm not going to do a death by PowerPoint presentation, because I don't really want you to focus on the particular numbers, because they're really not important. What's really important are the trends and the trajectories and the response options that we have available to us. But I will provide to Professor Hayes and to Professor Glynn a kind of a backgrounder document with all kinds of sources for people who happen to hear the talk and might want to learn more. So COP26, COP very generally means Conference of the Parties, and this is the 26th Conference of the Parties as part of something that's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. If you get involved in international environmental law and climate change, you have to become very conversant and comfortable with acronyms, because there are a lot of them, because it's a highly technical field. So what is this about? What COP26 is about, many of you have obviously probably heard of the Paris Agreement, which was concluded on December 12th of 2015 at COP22, which is the subsisting climate change agreement globally, which seeks to hold global warming, mean average global warming, to well below 2 degrees Celsius below the pre-industrial norm, and really to pursue efforts to maintain warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's a really stark challenge, because it's important to understand that based on the IPCC's most latest assessment, we've probably warmed as much as 1.3 degrees Celsius on average since 1870, when we have reliable estimates of the mean global average temperature around the time that the Industrial Revolution really picked up steam, no pun intended. And so how do we do that? What's at stake? So things haven't been progressing very well so far under the Paris Agreement. Since the Paris Agreement, global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise. Financing for fossil fuel production has continued to rise. And I just want to walk everybody through a few recent reports that will really help put in context just how little time that we have to begin to turn these critical trajectories around with respect to our global emissions, including here in Canada. And Professor Glynn is going to talk about as well the implications for New Brunswick. So we're going to go from global to local by the time we're through our discussion. And I'm going to try and be as brief as possible, and my colleague is as well, so we can really prioritize the Q&A period of time. But I think the most important thing that everybody needs to know about is something called the remaining carbon budget that's associated with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So one thing that we have learned is that every fraction of global warming, every fraction of a degree of warming brings with it increasingly disruptive impacts to human and natural systems that have a really high cost. And so all efforts that we can make to try and, as tight as the window is, as I suggested earlier, we may have, in fact, the estimates vary. If you're an absolute optimist, we've only warmed by about 0.8 of a degree Celsius. But if you're a pessimist and you want to be precautionary, and that's what international environmental law counsels you to do, which is to adopt the precautionary principle and adopt your policies based on that, we've warmed as much as 1.3, which means we only have 0.2 degrees left before we hit 1.5. And what the UN IPCC has told us, especially in its 2018 report with respect to the implications of 1.5 degrees warming, every fraction of a degree above where we are now at 1.3 and every fraction of a degree above 1.5 brings with it really costly disruptive impacts, more intense forest fires, weather events, storms, hunger, malnutrition, drought, migration, etc., biodiversity loss. So it's really critically important that we do everything that we can to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the way in which we kind of keep score, as it were, is what's called this remaining carbon budget associated with that temperature target. And the complication to the carbon budget is that the way in which we figure out, okay, how much as a globe, as a world, greenhouse gas emissions do we have left before we spend that budget and we go over budget and thereby incur the probability of going over the temperature target. These budgets are associated with, and I'm going to try and do this really quickly so it's not too complicated, they're associated with probabilities, okay? So we can think about three different scenarios, three different probabilistic scenarios. A 50% chance of keeping global warming to 1.5, which doesn't sound great. It's kind of a flip of the coin. I don't know about you, but I don't sleep very well at night thinking that we have a 50-50 chance of surpassing this critical threshold. And then there's a 66% chance that we can stay within that temperature. And then an 83% chance, which begins to feel, a little bit more, it's not exactly amazing. There's still a 17% chance in that scenario that we will surpass it, but 83 sounds not bad. So what are the carbon budgets associated with that? Well, with respect to a 50% chance, the world has 500 gigatons or 500 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions left. And what that means is that's it forever, that's what we can emit as a globe. For a 66% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial norm, we have 400 gigatons. And for an 83% chance, we have 300. So you can see as the probability goes up of meeting our goal, the less that we have that we can actually emit. Now, those numbers without context, I think, don't really mean anything. So for the year 2019, which is the year for which we have the most comprehensive data on greenhouse gas emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 were 59.1 gigatons, or 59 billion tons. So you can see that with respect to even the 50% chance, which gives us 500 gigatons left, that gives us fewer than 10 years to get to level out our trajectory and to be on a path to net zero by 2050. And then, excuse me, the greater the probability that we want to have with staying within 1.5, it means the fewer years. I think the best way to maybe put this in perspective, if that doesn't do it for you, Greta Thunberg recently released a really short film about the title of which is that something to the effect that politicians have failed, but humanity hasn't failed yet. And so many of you on tonight's lecture, maybe even the professors, will remember a very popular pop song that came out of South Korea called Gangnam Style. Does anybody remember that? Matthew remembers it because he loved that song. And that was 6 years ago. So if you can remember 6 years back, that puts it in perspective, because 6 years is about all we have left with an 83% chance of staying within our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we're talking about a very, very tight time frame based on business as usual emissions. So it means that we really need to bend the curve on global greenhouse gas emissions, both in terms of how we generate energy for our energy systems, but also in terms of our agricultural systems, which are also a very significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, and which tend to get neglected in these global talks. So much so, I want to run one factoid by you, which I find particularly shocking, which is even if we were to reach net zero emissions for all of our energy purposes, so the way we fuel our cars, the way we heat our homes, the way in which we light our office buildings, if we reach net zero by tomorrow, if we stayed on a business as usual trajectory with respect to agriculture, we would still exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. So we have to transform our energy systems, but also our agricultural systems. And we really need to do so this decade. So with that context in mind, what COP26 is about, and so this is the 26th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which the UNFCCC was created in 1992 in Rio, Brazil. And to put things in perspective, since 1992, the world has emitted 62% more greenhouse gas emissions since 1992 until the present day than the world had in the entire period from 1870 to 1992. So far, unfortunately, our approach to global climate diplomacy isn't working. And so the stakes of this particular COP26, the 26th meeting of the parties under this treaty convention, is to really ratchet up ambition. And there are really three broad things at stake in this meeting. And I'm going to tell you about those, and then I'm going to give you a couple of caveats, talk about a few different options, and then I'm going to stop. So what's at stake? Well, one thing that's at stake is the target itself, the 1.5 degrees target, which in many ways, because of the severe implications of every fraction of a degree of global warming, has replaced the well below 2 degree target as the main target of the Paris Agreement. However, not all countries in the world agree with that. And in particular, in these climate change negotiations, there's a real divide between the countries in the global north, on the one hand, developed countries like Canada and the United States and the countries of the European Union, and then countries of the global south, on the other hand, which historically haven't contributed as much to global warming as the richer countries in the global north. So for example, you may have seen the news that India's prime minister said that India will reach net zero emissions not by the year 2050, which is the year that climate science says that that's the year by which we really need to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but by the year 2070. And you may have noticed that China, which is still designated as a developing as opposed to a developed country, and it's not unfairly because its per capita emissions are well below the per capita emissions of a country like Canada, for example, has said that it will go net zero by 2060. Now, what that really means suddenly is that countries like Canada and the United States and Russia and the European Union really need to meet the net zero target earlier than 2050 if they're being fair and if they're living up to their historical cumulative role. So that's part of the negotiations at COP26. Another part of it is that in 2009, the countries making up the G20 committed to providing climate financing to go from rich developed countries to developing countries in the global south of 100 billion US per year starting by 2020. And unfortunately, that amount hasn't been met yet. And the reason that that amount is important is because developing countries need financial and also technical assistance in order to be able to mitigate their emissions. And they can't be expected to mitigate their emissions as quickly as developed countries. So that's another sticking point at this COP26, what we typically call it climate financing. And it's important to keep in mind that that 100 billion US figure is nowhere remotely near enough to allow countries in the global south not only to mitigate their own emissions, but also to begin to spend on infrastructure improvements in order to adapt to the climate change that is already baked into the system because of cumulative emissions. But it's an important starting place. And countries in the global north, the speeches of President Biden of the United States notwithstanding, really can't be expected to move aggressively on climate change action until they see those financing flows begin. And the third thing, which is a more technical thing, and I have a little bit of a, I don't know, potentially controversial caveat to make to it, but are very technical behind the scenes negotiations about the rules and regulations with respect to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is all about setting up a global carbon market whereby countries can trade emissions allowances and offsets. And so lawyers and economists are working on a system whereby everybody can agree on how to measure their emissions, how to measure the reductions that they've made, and to make sure that countries aren't double counting. Now, I kind of hope secretly that the first two things that are being negotiated at COP26 succeed. I want to see more financing from the global north flow to the global south. It's not only ethical, but it's also pragmatically important to enhance the capacity of those countries. And I also want to make sure, and I hope, that the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is maintained, because we know unequivocally from climate science that the world in which there's 2 degrees Celsius global warming looks a lot worse than a world in which it's only 1.5 degrees Celsius. And by the way, based on all of the countries under the Paris Agreement, their nationally determined contributions or their pledges under climate change, under the Paris Agreement, if they were to meet all of their pledges, and that's a huge if, because Canada is not on track to meet even its earlier unambitious target, let alone its new target. Even if we met all of our targets globally, we would be on track by the year 2100 for 2.7 degrees Celsius global warming. And that's just, the climate science tells us that that is really, really disruptive and really, really costly for both human and natural, and of course, human natural systems. But when it comes to a global carbon market for offsets, and I don't have time to get into this now, but maybe in the Q&A, I kind of hope that maybe they fail again. They failed the last time that they tried to negotiate these rules, and I don't think it's actually a good policy approach, but we can leave that aside. So what are the implications of all of this, and what are the implications for us, for people who are not at COP26? We're not in the back rooms negotiating. None of us, as of yet, is a president or prime minister of a country. We're just, people in the university and people who are concerned, and as Professor Glynn pointed out, freaked out about what's going on, myself included. And when giving these kinds of talks, I always struggle with trying to get the right balance between providing the numbers and the context to show how urgent the situation is. I think the students who organize this use the phraseology, "This is not a drill." That is absolutely correct. This is not a drill. This is not hypothetical. This is not a theoretical academic topic. We are really in a decade of make or break action for the climate and for human systems. And so what I think that means, Professor Hayes said, well, maybe you could talk about some of the key proposals that are on the table. Well, there are so many different plans and there's so many different ideas of tackling this. And if you're following what's going on at COP26, you may see announcements of these really bold pledges. So you might see, for example, that around 100 countries recently pledged to end deforestation by the year 2030. Well, you guys aren't old enough to understand that right around the time that Gangnam Style was a popular hit, unfortunately, that was the time that countries also came together and said that they would eliminate deforestation by 2020. But unfortunately, without enforceable mechanisms, we didn't meet that target. And so we're setting the same target again. So I guess I have two, and I'm going to premise this by saying that there are wholly unsatisfactory answers. I don't have the answers for you, but the two implications that I can say are, one, we all need to become more literate about COPs, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and global climate change, because we need to be able to understand both nationally, internationally, regionally, locally, in our own municipalities, what we're doing in terms of implementation. Professor Hayes and I recently went on a field trip to a little subdevelopment in Fredericton. And both of us, the whole time, we're looking at the subdevelopment and saying, this isn't going to be unsustainable. This isn't going to be sustainable 5 years from now, right? We're developing Fredericton as if there isn't a finite global carbon budget, as if we don't have 10 years in order to change our trajectories. We're building infrastructure in this country that's meant to last 25, 30, 40 years, that's going to be unsustainable in 5 to 10 years. So each of us has an obligation to learn as much as we can and talk to each other about what's happening and to be able to assess what's going on. That's number one. Number two, and this is my broader philosophical point, and this will be particularly good for the students that are here, but I think it applies to me and Professor Hayes and Professor Glynn equally well, and they'll know this because I say this to them ad nauseum. We have to change our lives. Nobody is coming to save us, right? As Greta says on the outskirts of COP26, it's just more blah, 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 blah from world leaders. The world leaders aren't going to save us. COP26 isn't going to save us. Don't believe the rhetoric that you might hear that COP26 is our last best chance to do this. Nothing really actually ever gets achieved at these meetings. It's a time for pledges and speeches, but what's really important is the implementation on the ground. And each of us has, I think, an ethical and an existential responsibility to change our lives and to dedicate our lives to addressing climate change. And with that, I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Glynn. Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I want to thank Dr. Hayes' students, Tabitha, Hillary, Emma, for all their work organizing this teach-in. And yeah, so I want to focus on the possibilities of a just energy transition in New Brunswick. So this title slide, I took this photo from Deborah Carr. I think this bird represents sort of our feelings on climate change. This is a picture that Deborah Carr took during the Raven, during a project with Raven that I'll talk a little bit more about later. So I want to focus on the possibilities of a just energy transition. So briefly touching on the climate culprits in New Brunswick, then briefly talking about the different kinds of climate solutions on the table, turning quickly to anti-capitalist solutions. So I see that some of my students are here and they know that that's where I spend more time on. And also talking about or giving a critical take on the just energy transition movement and where I think the movement needs to go, and also spending some time in Colombia and talking about what Colombia coal has to do with New Brunswick. In what is today called New Brunswick, which is really the stolen lands of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples, the biggest greenhouse gas polluters are listed here. So the Irving Oil Refinery in St. John, the NB Power coal-fired power plant in Beldoon, and the Colson Cove oil-fired power plant in St. John topped the biggest industrial greenhouse gas polluters list in 2019. So this table was produced by the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. And using the most recently available annual data from the National Pollutant Release Inventory database. So you'll see number 4 on that list is Glencore, the smelter. That smelter closed in 2019, so our greenhouse gas emissions from that has gone down as a result of that smelter closing. So other climate culprits include our old drafty homes. That means that we spend more energy heating our homes than we need to. Also, cars put loads of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. We have gas production sites in landfills emitting methane, a potent greenhouse gas, and the way that we treat our forests by clear cutting vast areas and converting naturally diverse forests into plantations is not climate friendly at all. We not only release carbon into the atmosphere, when we cut down trees, we also take away the flood control services that our forest gives us, which is important during a time of climate change and when we have more extreme weather events. So climate solutions that are generally grouped into either market-based solutions that involve things like carbon taxes, cap and trade schemes. Technological solutions are various. Some seem like a good idea, others sound a bit terrifying or are more controversial, like small modular nuclear reactors that are currently on the table, the development of which is currently being supported by the New Brunswick government. Groups like the Coalition for Responsible Energy Development, CRED, I see that Susan O'Donnell's here with us tonight. They are opposed to those to that development. We also have reforms and regulations such as putting caps on industrial greenhouse gas emissions, curbing deforestation and such. And we have anti-capitalist solutions that call on us to break with the economic system if we want to have any hope for the future. So more and more environmental activists and scholars are naming capitalism as the root of the environmental problems. Fred Magdoff and John Bellamy Foster have been writing articles and books on this, like what every environmentalist needs to know about capitalism for some time, to draw our attention to how capitalism is by its very nature creates what's called rifts and shifts. So rifts in the metabolic order of nature, meaning that capitalism degrades the soil, ecosystems to the point of no repair, no regeneration. And it also creates shifts. It either moves around environmental problems geographically, like when resources depleted in one area, then capital searches far and wide for another place, usually a cheaper place to extract that resource, or it shifts the way it produces. So for example, the shift from wood products to plastic products. So I think most anti-capitalists, including Foster and Magdoff, would say reforms, regulations, technologies are urgently needed. After all, there's no time to waste. It's an all hands on deck situation. But anti-capitalists are also concerned about how the reforms, regulations, technologies, tweaking the market, putting carbon taxes or other disincentives on people affect certain groups of people, especially those made vulnerable in our society. So many environmental solutions on the table cause harm to people and have created anti-environmentalist set of people. People don't want to identify with the environmental movement because they see racism and classism in population growth control strategies and carbon offset schemes that, that keep the carbon in the ground in one place only to destroy the forests of indigenous peoples somewhere else. Capitalism is really good at hiding the social relations behind how our goods and services are produced. So for example, we are shielded from knowing how the human cost of how our energy is produced. So this leads me to talking about Colombia and what Colombian blood coal has to do with the North Shore of New Brunswick and New Brunswick's climate story. So MB Power's Belledune coal-fired power plant burns coal extracted from mostly the Cerrejón coal mine in La Guajira region of Colombia, as well as another mine in Colombia and one in the United States. I think it's in Wyoming, and that's according to the last information I got from MB Power about a year ago. So the Cerrejón coal mine is owned by 3 multinational mining giants, Anglo American, BHP Billington, and Glencore. And the great climate denying corporation ExxonMobil was one of the companies that initially owned the mine, that got the mine off the ground in the 90s. So Glencore, one of the companies that owns the mine today, and is actually the world's largest mining company right now, with more than 220 billion US dollars in revenues last year, also owned the lead smelter in Belledune, which I mentioned was the 4th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the province in 2019 before it closed permanently. And so all these the 3 companies that own the Cerrejón coal mine are implicated in human rights abuses across the world, from the Philippines to Brazil. So why is Colombian coal called blood coal? So for one, in order to extract the coal, entire communities have been violently displaced to get at the coal under the ground. Today, many in the displaced communities, the indigenous Wayu and Afro-Colombian peoples, live in poverty and with no drinking water, a result of a diverted river for the mine. They suffer health conditions from living next door to one of the world's largest open pit coal mines. Also, Colombian coal is called blood coal because of the assassinations of the union leaders in the country and some at the coal mines. So Colombia is the most dangerous place in the world for people active in trade unions. Since 1989, so a period of 30 some years, more than 3,000 unionists have been murdered. And in most cases, nobody's brought to justice for the murder. So New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Massachusetts, and other places in the world source coal from Colombia for their power plants. When people here learned of the struggles around the coal mine in the early 2000s, they began organizing in solidarity with the affected community members and the mine workers. One of the first things we did was bring Jose Julio Perez to the Maritimes. So Jose Julio was from Tobacco, a community that no longer exists, wiped off the map for the Cerrejón mine. He told a Fredericton audience in 2006 that in the year 2001, 500 soldiers and 200 police officers evicted the residents of his community before bulldozing their homes. My first encounter with Jose Julio was a YouTube video that showed him being beaten as he was being removed from his home for the mine. So people from the Maritimes have also visited the coal region. One time when folks from here were going there, we filled suitcases with medical supplies to deliver to people in the coal region. We asked pharmacies in Fredericton to donate the supplies, and we were happy when pharmacists did not hesitate to give items that were on our list. And we educated them at the same time about where our energy, or where coal comes from. Debbie Kelly, an RCMP forensics officer from Nova Scotia, visited the region in 2006 and reported on starving children with bodies racked in open sores from exposure to contaminated water. So another thing we did to educate the public about Colombian coal was to pass out what looked like MB Power bills. These bills had the human and environmental costs on the bills, like how many communities were displaced for the mine. So when more people here started learning of the struggles of what people in Colombia face in relation to coal mining, some responded that we needed to boycott the coal. But many of us who were in contact with the community leaders and the mine workers there knew that that's not what they wanted. So acting in solidarity means listening to those who are most affected or oppressed and acting in a way that furthers equality and justice, in a way that recognizes that my liberation is linked and bound with your liberation. So solidarity work is messy and hard, and sometimes it's just charity, like sending medical supplies, but it's important if we are to create a more just and equal world. So in 2008, Jesus Brochero, a leader with the Mine Workers Union at the Cerrejón mine, he's pictured here in the left photo. He's in the center of that photo. He visited New Brunswick and met with then CUPE President Danny Legier on the left in that photo, and other union leaders, as well as MB Power executives, to ask for MB Power's support in the mine workers' demands for safe and healthy working conditions. So MB Power did write a letter to the coal mining company to express concern. This is an example of social unionism as opposed to business unionism, or unions engaging in social unionism don't limit their demands to just wages and better conditions for their members. They fight for all workers and people in their communities. So CUPE and the Mine Workers Union in Colombia, where MB Power sources its coal, is to be, I think, commended for their social unionism. CUPE has a global solidarity branch that often supports workers and people around the world, from the Philippines to Colombia. They were there when people were defending the water and resisting shale gas on Mi'kmaq territory. And now, as I'm sure you all know, many of the members are on strike, fighting for decent wages and pensions. CUPE has shown up for us, and I think it's important for us to show up for them. So join a picket line, bring them some treats, and tell Premier Higgs to get back to the negotiating table and give our frontline workers what they deserve. So Jose Brochero with the Mine Workers Union in Colombia told us that the mine has subcontracted about 60% of its workforce. Thousands of workers are not unionized at that mine, and they earn about 30% less than those who are directly employed by the mine and are unionized. So he said that also that 700 workers are reporting serious health problems, including blood lead poisoning, black lung disease, and spinal injuries. And according to Jesus, in the first 11 years of the mine's operations, unsafe working conditions claimed 14 lives. We know of one mine worker at the Cerrejón coal mine site, Adolfo Gonzalez Montes, who was assassinated. He was tortured and murdered in his home. We did a fundraiser at the Grad House to raise a few $100s to send to his family. So while the Mine Workers Union faces such challenges, they are also doing social unionism. In their collective bargaining, they have included the demands of the affected communities to adequate compensation. So I'd like to say that conditions have improved for people who live with the Cerrejón coal mine in their backyards, but recent reports from the community speak of more displaced communities and diverted rivers with the expansion of the mine, which means more contaminated water sources and more starvation. After all, it's impossible to grow food without water. So in Colombia, like here and elsewhere in the world, people are calling for a just transition away from coal and fossil fuels and towards a post-carbon future to stop runaway climate change. They're also linking the climate crisis to migrant justice struggles, like these social work students at STU, pictured in the center, did a few years ago. One of the demands from environmental justice activists in Colombia is the development of a plan for a just transition away from coal mining to greener sources of energy. They say this plan needs to be done with the active involvement of those who will be most affected by the phase out of coal, including workers and affected community members. This transition plan will need to include worker training programs in renewable energy, also in alternative livelihood plans for those who are no longer able to grow food because of the mine. So why is a just transition so hard to do? Well, powerful players are simply against it and have an interest in maintaining the status quo. Coal is one of the most prevalent sources of energy, while also being one of the most polluting. But even the coal mining CEOs are recognizing that the end of coal is near. The Canadian government is committed to getting off of coal by 2030, and the MB Power plant is supposed to be stopping the burning of coal by then, but the current Higgs government has said that New Brunswick needs until 2040 to get off coal, and the plan so far seems to be converting that coal-fired power plant into a gas-fired power plant that also would I assume emit greenhouse gases. So Colombia, as well as Baldoon and other places affected by the coal industry, will need to figure out the social and political changes needed for a just transition away from coal into an energy system that doesn't repeat the same mistakes of the past. The capitalist system that's based on profit will never deliver the future we want. It's a system that's based on alienation, the exploitation of people and the environment. We need a swift and just transition to a society that not only protects our precious land, air, health, and climate, but we also need a society that gives us meaningful jobs, decent healthcare, and treats no one as expendable or disposable like the coal industry has done. My great-grandfather never came home from a shift at the coal mine in Minto, New Brunswick in 1950, a time when the mine was also employing child labor. Today, children are drowning in abandoned coal mine pits in Indonesia's Borneo. So I'm worried that a just energy transition is in danger. It's in danger of at best being just a slogan, or worse, being co-opted by capital and interests who think we can just mine our way out of the climate crisis. So there are no silver bullets to the climate crisis. Recently, Judith Deutsch drew our attention to a human interest story in the wheel section of a Canadian newspaper that described two-car families transitioning from a hybrid to an electric vehicle as they try to be more sustainable. So the family often upgrades their car every few years because they want to have a more fuel-efficient vehicle. Electric vehicles are touted as a key part of just transition to a carbon neutral future, but electric vehicle battery chargers are plugged often into electrical outlets, electricity that's often supplied from fossil fuels or nuclear reactors. Deutsch also argues that electrical vehicles are a shining example of how when we focus, on one small part and conveniently delete the whole, we're not actually, getting anywhere. So we must consider the impacts of electrical vehicle production, including the life cycle of the different components that make up electrical vehicles on people. So the carbon footprint of the car, it includes, the asphalt roads, the cement in parking garages and driveways. Electrical vehicles are also heavy, and people are concerned that they'll tear apart our roads more. So there's many climate-linked externalities related to cars that we need to consider. Also, more electrical vehicles will mean more mining, more displaced communities like Jose Julio's, more violence when people don't want their lands taken for the mining of metals for car batteries. Then there's the carbon footprint of electrical vehicles, which includes the emissions of mining for the metals for the car batteries and for constructing the car's steel body. Steel and cement, are fossil fuel dependent products to manufacture. And make no mistake that mining corporations are lobbying government leaders right now during COP, but they've done it before, and they often show up at these UN meetings. I've been at these UN meetings where the mining CEOs or mining representatives will show up with badges that say they're with non-governmental organization badges, and while they're actually representing Rio Tinto or whatever mining company. These mining corporations, their just energy transition plans, and they do use those words, include mining the seabed for lithium, copper, manganese, nickel, and cobalt. So can you imagine the energy that will be required to get at these deposits in order to manufacture batteries for electrical vehicles? There's already well-documented horrific environmental, social, and human health impacts of mining lithium, cobalt, nickel in Bolivia, Ecuador, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in Indonesia. I've spent the last 20 years researching the social and environmental impacts of just one large-scale nickel mine and smelter on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, and I feel like I barely know the full nature of the environmental and social impacts. And now Indonesia says it wants to start 25 more nickel mines and smelters on that island and smaller islands immediately to meet the demand for nickel in electrical vehicle batteries. So the plans include dumping mine waste into the ocean. This is what this story here refers to, threatening the livelihoods of fisher folks and the protein sources of entire communities. Deep Green is a Canadian startup company wanting to mine the seabed's polymetallic nodules that are rich in cobalt and nickel and copper for electrical vehicles. In a brazen display of this company's influence, the Pacific Island nation of Nauru broke with the UN protocol in February 2019 by ceding its seat to the company's CEO, Gerard Berenstein, here at a meeting of the International Seabed Authority Council. So here we see a Canadian, the CEO of a Canadian startup representing the island nation of Nauru. So the pressing question that is before us is, how do we address the climate emergency when powerful mining companies expect to mine their way out of the crisis at the expense of the livelihoods and lives of workers, too, in the world's poorest regions? At the same time, the continued extraction of metals with the burning of fossil fuels, we know, will only accelerate global warming. A just energy transition needs to include workers and the most impacted by fossil fuel extraction and burning and mining, and those who will be displaced by climate change. I think we do need to go beyond mobilizations for climate action. While they're important, we need to do harder work of organizing more of a mass movement that's able to usher in the kind of society that we want to live in. So it means talking to more people and organizing, I think, where we are. And I'm reminded of what Berta Cáceres, the land defenders, told the world. She was assassinated for her activism against hydroelectric dams. So she told the world, we must undertake the struggle in all parts of the world, wherever we may be, because we have no other spare or replacement planet. We have only this one, and we have to take action. The Honduran people, along with international solidarity, can get out of this unjust situation, promoting hope, rebellion, and organizing ourselves for the protection of life. So I think I'll end there. I have a list of climate actions that I think confront capitalism, but maybe one of the things I do want to talk about, so it does involve, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, so no new gas or coal or oil. I think this is important in New Brunswick, and we have to end what's called energy poverty, retrofitting our drafty homes and apartments and buildings so that people use less energy and spend less on power bills. The New Brunswick Coalition for Tenants' Rights is interested in doing this work, and we've already started conversations with the Conservation Council about this. So we need to do this in a way that ensures that landlords don't increase rents for the retrofits that they do. And there's many more actions that we need to take. Some of them touching on what Jason said. I think we need to cancel the international debt of the Global South, recognizing the colonial roots of such debts, and that many regions of the Global South will be hardest hit by climate change and will have few resources to protect residents. And as climate change takes more of our coast, destroys crops, and displaces people with flooding and wildfires, we also have to support the free movement of people, climate refugees, across borders. So I included a slide with some of the groups that I think are working on this, that you're welcome to join. Some international solidarity groups that are right here, active in Fredericton and the Maritimes, like the Atlantic Regional Solidarity Network, Maritimes Guatemala Breaking the Silence Network, the Peace and Friendship Alliance that includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks who are working on educating people about the treaties, the peace and friendship treaties here, also resisting shale gas and other destructive projects here in the province. I included some independent media that I think you should check out, as well as some organizations that are also making the links between militarism and climate change too. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. MacLean and Dr. Glynn. It was really nice, and we appreciate that.